Story 1. A few years ago, I decided to go Black Friday shopping by myself on Thanksgiving night, excited to kick off the holiday season and find some great deals. My family always made a big deal out of Thanksgiving and Christmas, so I already had a mental list of gifts I wanted to buy for loved ones. After Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house, I planned to shop for just a couple of hours before heading back. I lived only 10 minutes away in my apartment, so it seemed like a simple plan. Around 9 p.m., I left my parents' house and drove to the local shopping area, starting with Target. The parking lot was packed when I arrived, with cars circling for spaces and crowds streaming in and out of the store. Inside, the energy was chaotic yet festive. People swarmed the aisles, carts overflowing with discounted items. I managed to find a few gifts I had planned and was relieved to cross them off my list. Once I paid and loaded my purchases into my car, I drove to Walmart, just a couple of minutes away for the next round. Walmart was just as hectic, with shoppers moving in every direction and employees struggling to keep up. Despite the crowds, I found everything I needed fairly quickly. By 1 a.m., I was ready to call it a night. I left the store feeling satisfied and excited to head back to my parents' house. As I drove out of the Walmart parking lot, I took a quieter exit on the side of the store. It was much darker and less crowded there, with fewer lights and no other cars in sight. That's when I noticed someone sitting on the curb by the road. A small figure wearing a bright pink jacket. From a distance, it looked like a child sitting alone in the dark. Concerned, I slowed down, wondering if they needed help. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a child but a petite woman, maybe in her early 20s. She was small, about 5 feet tall, and wore a winter hat pulled down over her long brown hair. She stood up as I stopped the car and walked over to my window. Her eyes looked tired, and she seemed anxious. Before I could say anything, she asked if I could help her. She said she was stranded and needed a ride home, claiming she didn't live far. I hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea to let a stranger into my car. But her voice wavered like she was on the verge of tears. Reluctantly, I agreed, figuring it was late and I could spare a few minutes. She climbed into the passenger seat and gave me an address. I entered it into my GPS and saw it was only 7 minutes away. That reassured me as it wasn't far out of my way. As we drove, we made small talk about Thanksgiving and shopping, and she seemed friendly enough. Still, I couldn't shake a slight unease. Something about her nervous energy felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The drive was short, but as we approached the neighborhood, I noticed the houses looked run down, with many in need of repairs. The streets were dimly lit, and the area had an unfamiliar, rough feel to it. Her address was at the end of a narrow street. I pulled into the driveway and stopped the car. "Is this it?" I asked. She nodded, but didn't immediately get out. Instead, she stayed on her phone, typing something. I waited for a moment, then gently prompted her, saying, "Well, I better head back now." She finally thanked me and opened the door, but as she stepped out, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. 2 men suddenly appeared, one sprinting from behind the house, and the other from the opposite side. They were coming straight for my car. My heart raced as panic set in. I realized this was a setup. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas pedal hard. My tires screeched as I backed out of the driveway. The men reached my car just as I started moving. One of them grabbed at the open passenger door, but I hit the lock button just in time. The door swung shut as I reversed into the street. Quickly, I shifted into drive and sped away, glancing in my rearview mirror. Both men were now in the street, watching me flee, while the woman stood motionless in the driveway. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, adrenaline pumping through me. As soon as I was a safe distance away, I pulled over and called the police. I described everything: the woman, the men, and the address. The dispatcher assured me they would send someone to investigate. Still shaken, I drove straight back to my apartment, checking my mirrors constantly to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I got home, I locked all my doors and sat in my car for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Reflecting on the night, I realized how close I had come to serious danger. The woman had likely been a decoy, using her vulnerable appearance to lure me in. I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't driven away in time. The thought made my stomach turn. I was angry at myself for letting my guard down, and angry at the people who had tried to take advantage of my kindness. I later found out from the police that the address I had been given was tied to multiple reports of suspicious activity. It seemed the area was notorious for setups like the one I had narrowly escaped. While I was grateful to have avoided harm, the experience left me wary of strangers and much more cautious about helping others. That night changed how I view situations like this. While it's important to be compassionate, it's equally important to prioritize your safety. Now, if I ever encounter someone in need, I think twice before getting involved, and I always try to find safer ways to help. Looking back, I feel incredibly lucky to have escaped unharmed, and I hope my story serves as a reminder to others to trust their instincts and stay vigilant, even when things seem harmless. Story 2. A few years ago, I was working at a smaller retail clothing store. It was a cozy place with just a handful of employees, and I enjoyed the quieter environment compared to larger stores. I had been working there for about a year and had always felt comfortable. The holiday season, however, brought its challenges, especially Black Friday. That year, we opened early at 6 a.m. instead of our usual 9 a.m., hoping to catch the early rush of shoppers flooding the area. Although we weren't offering massive discounts like the big chains, we still expected a surge of customers. Our team of 5 was scheduled to handle the day, more than our usual 2 or 3 employees at a time. I was set to work the morning shift, from 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. The first few hours were manageable, busier than usual, but nothing we couldn't handle. Customers trickled in steadily, and I spent most of my time at the register, ringing up purchases and chatting with shoppers. It wasn't until later in the morning, closer to my break, that the store became noticeably more crowded. When it was finally time for my break, I felt relieved. I'd been on my feet for hours, and my legs were starting to ache. Our break room was tucked away at the back of the store, down a short hallway that also housed a bathroom. The room was small and simple, with a couple of tables, some chairs, and a TV mounted on the wall. I made my way there, eager for a few moments of peace. Once inside, I sank into one of the chairs and pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages and notifications. About 15 minutes into my break, I stood up to return to the sales floor, but when I went to open the door, It wouldn't budge. Confused, I jiggled the handle, assuming it was stuck. I tried again, putting more force into it, but it wouldn't move. Panic started to creep in. Was the door broken? Was someone holding it shut? "I'm stuck in the break room," I wrote. "The door won't open." While I waited for a response, I sat back down, trying to calm myself. Then, unexpectedly, the door opened. I looked up, expecting to see my coworker. Instead, a man stepped into the room. He didn't work at the store, but I recognized him from earlier. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a large build, a scruffy beard, and a worn jacket. He had been browsing the store earlier, but nothing about him had stood out at the time. Now, standing in the break room, his presence was jarring. "Excuse me, this is an employee's own area," I said, trying to sound firm. He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression unreadable. My heart started pounding as I backed away. His silence and the way he moved toward me were unnerving. "You're not supposed to be back here," I repeated, louder this time. But he still didn't answer. Instead, he lunged. Instinct took over. I darted to the emergency exit at the back of the break room. The door wasn't used often, and I wasn't sure if it would set off an alarm, but I didn't care. I shoved it open and ran outside, feeling the cold air hit my face. The man followed close behind, his heavy footsteps pounding the ground. We were now in a side parking lot, a quieter area of the shopping center where fewer cars were parked. He grabbed me by the arms near my shoulders, his grip strong and unrelenting. I struggled, twisting and turning, trying to break free. My shouts echoed in the empty lot, but no one seemed to hear. Then he clamped a hand over my mouth, muffling my screams. I fought harder, kicking and flailing, desperate to get away. He started dragging me toward a car parked nearby, and I realized, with horror, that this was no random encounter. He had planned this. Just as we neared the car, I heard shouting from behind. "Hey! Let her go!" A voice rang out, clear and loud. My coworker had followed us through the emergency exit, and she wasn't alone. More voices joined hers, growing louder as people came into view. A group of bystanders had gathered near the door, drawn by the commotion. The man hesitated, his grip on me loosening slightly as he turned to look. Seizing the moment, I wrenched free from his grasp and stumbled backward, putting as much distance as I could between us. The man looked at me, then at the growing crowd, his expression shifting to one of anger and frustration. Realizing he was outnumbered, he shoved me away and bolted for his car. He climbed and sped off, tires screeching as he fled the scene. Shaking, I collapsed onto the ground, overwhelmed by a mix of fear and relief. My coworker ran over, followed by a few others who had witnessed the incident. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I nodded, though I was far from fine. Someone called the police, and within minutes, officers arrived to take my statement, his height, build, clothing, and told them everything that had happened. They assured me they would do everything they could to track him down. The rest of the day was a blur. My manager gave me the rest of the day off, and I spent the next few days recovering from the ordeal. The police later informed me that they had identified the man based on surveillance footage and witness reports. He had a history of similar incidents, and though I was relieved he had been caught, the experience left a lasting impression. I learned to be more cautious, especially in situations where I might be alone. While I'm grateful for the quick actions of my coworker and the bystanders who intervened, I can't help but think about what could have happened if they hadn't been there. That day changed how I view safety, and it's a reminder to trust your instincts and stay vigilant, even in familiar environments. Black Friday has never been the same for me, and I haven't worked a holiday shift since. Story 3. A few years ago, I decided to go Black Friday shopping alone. It was Thanksgiving night, and I wanted to start my Christmas shopping early. My family had already celebrated Thanksgiving at my parents' house, where we enjoyed a big meal and shared stories about past holiday traditions. Around 9 p.m., after saying goodbye to everyone, I left for my first stop, Target. I lived about 10 minutes away from my parents, so I figured I could shop for a couple of hours and then return to their place before heading home. When I arrived at Target, the parking lot was overflowing. Cars were circling, looking for spots, and the store looked just as packed. Inside, the energy was electric. Shoppers crowded every aisle, carts full of discounted items. I managed to grab everything on my list after some careful navigating, checked out, and headed to my car. With one store down, I decided to drive over to Walmart, which was just a few minutes away. Walmart was even busier than Target. The store was chaotic, with customers swarming the aisles and employees doing their best to restock shelves. I found most of what I needed fairly quickly, though, and after about 30 minutes, I was ready to call it a night. I paid for my items and headed to my car, satisfied with my shopping haul. It was just past 1 a.m. when I left the store. As I was driving out of Walmart's parking lot, I took a quieter exit along the side of the building. This part of the lot was much darker, with fewer lights and hardly any people. That's when I noticed something unusual, a small figure sitting alone on the curb just off the road. From a distance, it looked like a child wearing a bright pink jacket. Concerned, I slowed down. It was late, and the area didn't seem safe for a child to be sitting alone. When I got closer, I realized it wasn't a child, but a petite woman. She stood up as I pulled over, walking toward my car. She looked to be in her early 20s, wearing a winter hat and long brown hair that framed her pale face. She seemed anxious and upset. I rolled down my window, and before I could say anything, she asked me for help. She said she was stranded and needed a ride home. Her voice cracked as if she was about to cry, and she insisted that she lived nearby. I hesitated, unsure about giving a ride to a stranger, but she looked harmless, small, frail, and clearly upset. Against my better judgment, I told her to get in. She climbed into the passenger's seat and gave me an address. I typed it into my GPS, relieved to see it was only 7 minutes away. I reassured myself that this wouldn't take long. As we drove, the woman seemed to relax a little. We made small talk, chatting about Thanksgiving and Black Friday shopping. She was polite and even smiled a few times, but something about her felt off. She seemed distracted, constantly glancing at her phone. Still, I dismissed my unease, figuring she was just relieved to be getting home. The drive went quickly, and soon we arrived in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The houses here were small and run down, with dim streetlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. The address she gave me led to a house at the end of a narrow street. The driveway was empty, and the house itself looked dark. I pulled in and stopped the car. "Is this it?" I asked. She nodded, but didn't move. Instead, she stayed on her phone, typing furiously. Sense of unease washed over me. "All right, well, I hope you have a good night," I said, trying to gently encourage her to leave. She finally opened the door and stepped out, but as soon as she did, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. 2 men appeared, one coming from the left side of the house and the other from the right. They were running straight toward my car. Panic surged through me. I threw the car into reverse and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as I backed out of the driveway. One of the men reached the passenger door just as I started to move, grabbing at the handle. Thankfully, I had locked the doors earlier. The door stayed shut as I sped backward into the street. By the time I reached the sidewalk, after an awkward pause, the door had thoroughly burst. I shifted into drive and floored the gas pedal, my heart pounding as I raced away. In my rearview mirror, I saw the 2 men standing in the street, watching me. The woman was still in the driveway, her arms crossed. It was clear now that this had been a setup. They had planned to trap me. As I drove away, I called the police, describing everything: the woman, the men, and the address. The dispatcher took my information and assured me they would send officers to investigate. My hands were trembling as I hung up. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to serious danger. My mind raced with questions. What if I hadn't seen the men in time? What were they planning to do? Rob me? Hurt me? When I finally made it back to my apartment, I parked and sat in the car for a moment, trying to collect myself. I locked the doors and double-checked my surroundings before going inside. Once I was safely inside, I received a follow-up call from the police. They told me the address I had given them was tied to previous reports of suspicious activity. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened there. The realization hit me hard. I had been lured into a trap. The woman's innocent appearance and desperate plea for help had been an act meant to lower my defenses. I felt a mix of anger and gratitude. I was furious at them for trying to exploit my kindness, but I was also deeply thankful that I had trusted my instincts and acted quickly enough to escape. That night left a lasting impression on me. I no longer stopped to help strangers in isolated areas, no matter how harmless they appear. While it's important to be compassionate, I've learned that prioritizing my safety comes first. I still think about what could have happened if I had let my guard down for just a moment longer. It's a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary situations can turn dangerous. Story 4. When I was younger, I worked at Target for about a year. During that time, I experienced one of the wildest shifts of my life, working on Black Friday. In those days, Target would open on Thanksgiving night, and in my year, the doors opened at 6 p.m., signaling the start of an overnight frenzy that would spill into the following day. Every employee was called in to work that night, and I was no exception. I typically worked as a sales associate, occasionally jumping in as a cashier when needed, and this shift was set to be one I would never forget. Arriving a little before we opened, I saw the parking lot already packed to the brim, something I had never seen before. Normally, employees parked closer to the building, but I had to leave my car in the farthest corner of the lot. Even at that distance, I could see the long line of eager shoppers stretching across the entrance, at least 100 people deep, clutching flyers and chatting excitedly. as I walked past the crowd toward the employee-only entrance, I realized that I had never gone shopping on Thanksgiving night before. Only early on Black Friday morning. This was an entirely new level of madness. Inside, the energy was buzzing. Every available team member was present, donning red shirts and name tags. We had a short meeting in the back to discuss the plan for the night. Managers reminded us to stay patient, be vigilant for any issues, and keep the lines moving. It was clear that we were bracing for a tidal wave of customers. By the time the managers walked over to unlock the front doors, I was stationed at my check lane, ready to ring people up. I remember standing there, watching as the first wave of customers came pouring in like water through a broken dam. The first hour was chaotic. Most shoppers ran straight for the electronics section where the biggest deals were. Soon, carts piled high with TVs, gaming systems, and kitchen appliances began lining up at the registers. Every single lane was open, and we were moving as fast as we could. I rang up items non-stop, barely catching my breath between customers. Some people were cheerful, while others grew frustrated over out-of-stock items or long waits. For the first 3 hours of my shift, I barely looked up from the scanner. Around 9 p.m., a manager came over to relieve me for my break. Grateful for the pause, I turned off my lane light and made my way to the break room. The store was packed, and I had to weave through the crowds to get there. Even with my name tag off, I was stopped by several customers asking for help, and I directed them as best I could before slipping into the employee-only area. Finally, in the break room, I sat down, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through messages. Among the usual texts and Snapchats from friends, one message caught my attention. It was from an unknown number. Normally, I was meticulous about saving contacts, so it was rare for me not to recognize someone texting me. The message read, "When you're on your break, meet me at the back of the store." I frowned, unsure who it could be. I texted back, "Who is this?" but received no immediate response. Dismissing it, I replied to the other messages and relaxed for a few more minutes. Then, the unknown number texted again. "Just come to the back of the store." My curiosity was piqued, but also tinged with unease. It could have been a coworker playing a prank, but why wouldn't they just say who they were? Against my better judgment, I decided to go. The message was vague, and the back of the store could mean any number of places. Our large stockroom, the receiving area, or even the dimly lit employee parking lot. As I made my way toward the back, the store's crowd grew denser. Shoppers stopped me repeatedly to ask questions. One person wanted to know if a certain product was still in stock. Another asked for directions to the toys. By the time I reached the back of the store, I had spent several minutes just navigating through the chaos. Once there, I walked along the aisles, scanning for anyone who might be waiting for me, but no one approached. Nobody called out my name or gave me any indication that they were the one who had sent the texts. After a few minutes, I gave up and returned to the break room. Toward the end of my break, my phone buzzed again. It was the same number. This time, the message read, "I saw you. It was too busy. I'll catch you after work at midnight." My stomach dropped. How did this person know what time my shift ended? I felt a chill. but brushed it off, convincing myself it was just a joke. I sent another message asking, "Who is this?" but didn't get a reply. When my break ended, I went back to work. My manager moved me to the sales floor, where I spent the rest of my shift helping customers and restocking items. The store remained busy, and I didn't have much time to think about the strange messages. By the time midnight approached, the crowd had thinned slightly, but the store was still far from quiet. When the clock struck 12, I clocked out and headed toward the parking lot, eager to go home. As I walked to my car, I felt my phone vibrate again. Another text from the unknown number appeared. "I'm waiting by your car." My heart raced as I glanced toward my car, parked in the farthest corner of the lot. From a distance, I could see a dark SUV idling next to it, its engine running. My instinct screamed at me to turn back. Without hesitation, I walked back into the store and went straight to the break room, where a few co-workers were still hanging out. One of them, Lexi, was my close friend. I told her about the texts, and her face went pale. She admitted that earlier in the night, a man had approached her claiming to be a friend of mine and asking for my number. She described him as tall, thin, with a short beard and dark hair, someone I didn't recognize. We immediately informed the security guard on duty, who agreed to escort me to my car. When we stepped outside, the SUV was still there. As we approached, the vehicle sped off, disappearing into the night. I was shaken but relieved to get into my car and drive home safely. That night left me with more questions than answers. Who was that man? How long had he been watching me? And what were his intentions? To this day, I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and avoided what could have been a very dangerous situation. Story 5. Working at Target when I was younger was mostly an enjoyable experience, but nothing could have prepared me for the madness of Black Friday. During my year-long stint, I worked countless shifts, some busier than others, but none came close to the sheer chaos I faced on Thanksgiving night. That year, Target decided to open its doors at 6 p.m. on Thanksgiving itself, staying open all night and into Black Friday. Every employee, myself included, was scheduled to work that night. I usually worked as a sales associate, occasionally filling in as a cashier, but this shift was unlike anything I had experienced before. I arrived at the store just before opening, and the scene outside was overwhelming. The parking lot, which was massive, was already full, forcing me to park in one of the furthest corners. As I walked toward the entrance, I saw a line stretching around the side of the building. Hundreds of eager shoppers clutched flyers, some chatting excitedly, others with their eyes glued to the doors, ready to pounce on the deals. The energy was palpable, and a sense of dread crept over me as I realized just how wild this night would be. I entered through the employee-only entrance, weaving through the chaos outside. The break room was already packed with team members, all of us dressed in our red shirts and name tags. Before the doors opened, our managers gathered us for a quick meeting. They gave the usual pep talk about staying patient and helping as many customers as possible, while reminding us to stay safe and watch out for any unusual behavior. As the meeting ended, my nerves kicked in. The managers made their way to the entrance, and I headed to my assigned station, the cash register. When the doors opened, it was like the floodgates had been unleashed. Customers surged inside, many of them running straight for the electronics section, where the best deals were. From my check lane, I watched in awe as people sprinted with carts, arms piled high with TVs, gaming consoles, and other heavily discounted items. Within minutes, the store was packed, and the lines at every register were growing. Almost every check lane was open, including mine, and the non-stop rush of customers began. For the first 3 hours, I barely had time to breathe. I rang up items at lightning speed, scanning barcodes and bagging purchases as fast as I could. Some customers were cheerful, thanking me for my help, while others were clearly stressed, impatiently tapping their feet or snapping at the wait times. Despite the chaos, I managed to keep up, doing my best to stay polite and efficient. Around 9 p.m., a manager came over and told me it was time for my break. I turned off my lane light, grabbed my things, and headed to the break room. Walking through the store was a challenge. Even without my name tag on, I was stopped by several customers asking for help finding items or checking if something was still in stock. By the time I reached the break room, I was exhausted. I sank into a chair, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through my messages. Among the usual texts from friends and family, one stood out. It was from an unknown number, and the message was strange. "When you're on your break, meet me at the back of the store." I frowned, wondering who it could be. I was meticulous about saving contacts, so it was unusual for me not to recognize someone texting me. I replied, "Who is this?" and then went back to replying to other messages, trying not to overthink it. A few minutes later, the unknown number texted again, "Just come to the back of the store." My curiosity grew, but so did my unease. I wondered if it could be a coworker playing a prank, or someone from the crowd outside who had somehow gotten my number. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. The message didn't specify where in the back of the store, so I headed toward the stockroom area, navigating through the throngs of shoppers. The store was still packed, and my progress was slow. Several people stopped me along the way to ask questions, and I answered as best as I could before continuing. When I reached the back of the store, I didn't see anyone I recognized. I walked along the aisles, scanning the area, but no one approached me or called out. After a few minutes, I gave up and returned to the break room to finish the remainder of my break. Toward the end of my break, my phone buzzed again. It was another text from the same number. "I saw you. It was too busy, but I'll catch up with you after work at midnight." My stomach sank. How did this person know when my shift ended? I replied again, asking, "Who is this?" but received no response. Shaking it off, I went back to work, telling myself it was probably just a prank. For the rest of the night, I stayed busy. I was moved from the register to the sales floor, helping restock items and assisting customers. The store remained hectic, and I didn't have much time to think about the strange texts. By midnight, the rush had slightly subsided, and I was relieved when it was finally time to clock out. As I walked out to the parking lot, the crowd outside had thinned, but it was still far from empty. I headed toward my car in the far corner of the lot, feeling the cool night air against my face. Then, my phone vibrated again. It was another text from the unknown number. "I'm waiting by your car." I froze, glancing toward my car in the distance. Next to it was a dark SUV with its engine running. I couldn't see inside, but my instincts told me something was wrong. I turned and walked back into the store without hesitation, heading straight for the break room. Inside, I found one of my closest co-workers, Lexi, and told her what was happening. Her face went pale as she admitted that earlier in the night, a man had approached her, claiming to be a friend of mine and asking for my number. Thinking he was genuine, she gave it to him. She described him as tall, thin, with a slight beard and short, dark hair, someone I didn't recognize. We quickly informed the security guard, who offered to walk me to my car. When we got outside, the SUV was still there, but as we approached, it sped off, disappearing into the night. I made it home safely, but the experience left me shaken. Who was this man? How long had he been watching me? To this day, I don't know, but I've never forgotten that eerie Thanksgiving night at Target. Story 6. It was my first Black Friday working as a temporary employee at an electronics store. I had been hired just a month prior to help with the holiday rush. On that infamous Friday, we were scheduled to open at 5 a.m., but I had to be there by 3:30 to help with setup. The entire staff had been warned during training. Black Friday was not for the faint of heart. The deals were insane, the crowds were relentless, and the atmosphere was always on the verge of chaos. As a nervous 19-year-old, I had no idea what I was walking into. When I arrived, the line outside the store was already staggering. Hundreds of people wrapped around the building, bundled in coats and scarves, clutching thermoses of coffee. Some had camping chairs, and a few looked like they hadn't slept in days. The air was cold, and the chatter outside sounded like a low hum of anticipation. We were instructed not to make eye contact with the crowd as we entered through the employee-only entrance. The managers said it would only add to their frenzy. Inside, the store was a stark contrast to the icy outdoors. Bright fluorescent light lit up the aisles, and the staff buzzed with last-minute preparations. The sales floor was meticulously arranged, towering stacks of discounted TVs, pallets of gaming consoles, and aisles filled with headphones, laptops, and other gadgets. We each had our assignments, and mine was the TV section. As 5 a.m. approached, the atmosphere grew tense. A manager stood near the front doors, holding a walkie-talkie. She counted down the minutes and gave us one last pep talk, telling us to stay calm and prioritize safety. Then, at exactly 5, the doors were unlocked and all hell broke loose. The sound of the crowd rushing in was like a stampede. People sprinted down the aisles, carts clattering, voices shouting. Within seconds, the TV section was swarmed. Customers grabbed boxes off the stacks as if their lives depended on it, yelling to friends and family to secure their spots. I tried my best to answer questions and direct people to the right models, but it was impossible to keep up. At one point, a man nearly knocked me over as he wrestled a 55-inch TV from another shopper. Security had to intervene before it turned into a full-blown fight. Around 6 a.m., the adrenaline began to wear off and exhaustion set in. The store was still packed, but the initial frenzy had subsided. I was restocking an empty shelf when I noticed a woman standing nearby, staring at the TVs. She looked different from the other shoppers, calm, almost hesitant. Her cart was empty, and she held a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. She smiled faintly and held up the paper. "I'm looking for this TV," she said. It was a 40-inch model on sale for a ridiculously low price. I glanced at the shelf where it should have been and saw nothing but a large, empty space. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I think we're sold out." Her shoulders slumped, and her face fell. "It's for my son," she said quietly. "He's been saving up for it all year." I felt a pang of sympathy. Black Friday could bring out the worst in people. But moments like this reminded me that not everyone was here for greed. Some were just trying to make someone else happy. I told her to wait while I checked the back for any leftover stock. The stockroom was chaos. Employees darted around, pulling pallets and replenishing shelves, shouting over each other to be heard. I navigated through the maze of boxes, scanning for the model she wanted. Finally, wedged behind a larger TV, I found it. One last box. I grabbed it and carried it back to the sales floor. When I handed it to her, her face lit up. "Thank you so much," she said. "This means the world to him." Moments like that made the madness worthwhile. But the peace didn't last long. As I returned to the TV section, I heard shouting from a nearby aisle. Two men were arguing over the last gaming console, their voices growing louder by the second. Before I could call for security, one of them grabbed the box and bolted, leaving the other man cursing and yelling. By the time my shift ended at noon, I was completely drained. The store was a mess, with empty shelves, scattered packaging, and discarded items everywhere. My feet ached, my voice was hoarse from answering countless questions, and my nerves were shot. But as I clocked out and walked past the dwindling crowd, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of accomplishment. Black Friday was chaotic, exhausting, and often ridiculous, but it was also a crash course in human nature. I saw the best and worst of people that day, the kindness of a mother buying a TV for her son, the greed of shoppers fighting over gadgets, and the determination of a staff that held it all together. As I drove home, the adrenaline finally wearing off, I knew one thing for sure: I'd never look at Black Friday the same way again.